I've got 3 devices trying to load it and none of them are having it, but we'll see. It might do it on this new one. Are you all ready or do we want to wait for another person?
No, I believe we can go ahead and get started.
And we're recording? Okay, good. Welcome to the May 12th, 2022 Lawrence Douglas County Metropolitan Planning Organization Policy Board meeting. First, our Jessica will give us, oh, well, actually, let's do roll first. Jessica, can you do the roll for us?
Paul, go ahead.
Carter. Kelly. Larson. Messina. Here. Roberts.
Here.
Shanklin.
Here.
And Shipley.
Here.
I have a few housekeeping items now. Good afternoon. This meeting is being recorded and broadcast on the city's YouTube channel and cable channel 25. Please remember to mute yourself during the meeting when you are not speaking. The chat function of this public meeting is disabled and all chats will directly come to staff. Unless you're participating during the meeting, please turn off your video. This allows the active meeting participants to be seen on the screen. You will still be able to hear the meeting, and when participating, please turn your video on. If you have any trouble, you can send me a chat. We reserve the right to mute or turn individual video on and off to minimize distractions. And now I'll turn the meeting back over to Chair Courtney Shipley.
All right. This is Courtney Shipley. The next item is public comment. Do we have any public comment?
Jessica Mortinger, Transportation Planning Manager. There is no one in person and no one online has indicated they would like to make comment today.
All right, thank you. That brings us to approving the minutes for April 21st, 2022. Are there any questions or comments about the minutes or any motions?
Motion to approve.
I'll second that.
Okay, we have a first and a second, so we'll let Paul call roll.
Messina.
Aye.
Roberts.
Aye.
Shanklin.
Yes.
Shipley.
Aye.
The motion passes 4-0.
All right, then that brings us to our regular agenda item, which is the Lawrence Pedestrian Plan.
Okay. Let me share my screen. Is that working? You can see my screen. There we go. All right. We are presenting today the work we have done over the past year of the development of the Lawrence Pedestrian Plan to update the Lawrence portion of the regional pedestrian plan that was previously done prior to that. We started this process working with the MPO Policy Board as you established the Lawrence Pedestrian Plan Steering Committee and staff advisors. And so we began meeting with the staff advisors to draft a scope of work, and we'll talk about that in a second. And we worked with the steering committee members then to revise and verify that scope of work as we began this process to draft a pedestrian plan. This advances much of the work from the previous pedestrian plan and pedestrian bicycle issues task force that had happened in Lawrence. And so you can see a screenshot of them meeting virtually here and that membership, which we really tried to represent diverse stakeholders in the process. As I talk about a scope of work, we recognize the need to really talk about the long-term vision for walkability. We had some call to identify sidewalk network gaps that improved access to bus stops, healthy food destinations, and parks. And the goal there was to add those to the gaps that had already been identified on collector, arterial, and safe routes to school routes. And so that's to really complete that vision of a priority network. And we'll talk about that a little more in a second. We wanted to take the opportunity to analyze the distribution of existing sidewalks across the block groups in our community in relationship to the transportation disadvantaged populations index that we have previously created that shows where we have a predominance of populations that are above average of populations that have transportation disadvantages. And so the idea here was to understand if there's disparity in relationship to where there's sidewalk access in our community. We wanted to explore some pedestrian-oriented design and the opportunity to recognize that the Land Development Code update is underway and recognize the need for kind of the work we needed to do around pedestrian crossings. We looked at recognizing also that there is ongoing work in a lot of different areas that was happening that may not be directly inside the scope of this plan. It wouldn't be done as part of this plan, but it needed to coordinate and be consistent with those projects and programs. And that's things like sidewalk improvement, ADA transition implementation, for public buildings, brick and sidewalk streets committee work that the city of Lawrence has underway, but we found hasn't met regularly, but it's still in the workload, and plans for the 2023 ADA transition plan for the public right of way. We also hope to explore some national best practices, and you'll see some of those that came across through our recommendations in the plan for walkability. It's not just about the built environment, there's a lot of other components, and we explore some of those in this planning process. This is kind of the timeline that we began. We really took the opportunity to explore where we've been since the 2016 documents to identify some of the gaps and needs in the existing planning and built environment and infrastructure space around pedestrian access and walkability. We went out for community engagement to identify issues and barriers that they experience around walking and to help set priorities for some of the work you'll see in the recommendations. We began, you can kind of see those green blocks really represent each of the components that we frame around the scope of work that we created. And then we had an opportunity to post the plan for public comment and collect comments from the community. And then we are in the plan approval phase, and we had the opportunity to work with our steering committee and the TAC Technical Advisory Committee and the Multimodal Transportation Commission already to review and confirm kind of staff response to those comments, as both MMTC and the Technical Advisory Committee have recommended approval of the pedestrian plan. Most familiar, we're not going to talk about all these statistics, I think, but as people think about where we've been from walkability, the recognition comes to some of the built environment projects that we've done, that we've been tackling, that begins with a lot of the larger transportation alternative projects, our safe routes to school, gap infill, sidewalks as part of larger road projects. And so that's the part I think that some people, if you live by those or those are in your vicinity, that's the things maybe you're most aware of. But the reality of this is that since the last plan, there's been significant other work in programs and projects that has happened. And I'll just highlight a few of those for you. That includes things like the Multimodal Transportation Commission has been established. There's been, the City of Lawrence has received a silver level friendly, walk friendly community. There's been dedicated bicycle and pedestrian funding, and the establishment of the non-motorized prioritization process, enforcement of the sidewalk improvement program, establishment and implementation of the neighborhood traffic management program, in which traffic speeds and traffic enforcement have made more comfortable streets and environments, development and implementation of Lawrence safe routes to school. And that's not just the built environment stuff, that's our education maps, that's our programming That's other policy work. The improvements to the right-of-way management program, including pedestrian detours and how those are being established and the change in those standards, and signal coordination and pedestrian crossing times. So we highlight a bunch of other work that has been ongoing during that time frame that make that all impact and improve walkability. When we went out to the community, we talk about really wanting to work to understand what are the barriers they're still facing. We know the needs in most part exceed the resources to target and achieve some of these things. And so if we talk about let's review just really quickly, high level, the first 5 barriers people addressed with us: busy streets with no sidewalk, sidewalks in disrepair or tripping hazard, drivers not watching for yielding people crossing the streets or driveways, gaps or no sidewalks, and drivers going too fast. And so here you can see we're talking about sidewalk gaps. They're the absence of sidewalk as part of the network, sidewalk condition maintenance, and driver behavior. And so hopefully the recommendations that we include as future action in the plan that's ongoing, either ongoing work or new work, hopes to tackle and address some of those barriers over time as we work to implement this pedestrian plan. The public was asked about the vision statement. This is slightly modified from the previous plan based on feedback we heard in regards to understanding that we needed to be more explicit about all ages and abilities, including those who travel with an assistive device, and the recognition that equity should be a component of the work that we're doing, recognizing that certain populations have less transportation choice, and we need to be aware where the impact of our investments are being made across the community. And so this vision for the future was revised from the previous plan to reflect the conversation that we heard from the community. We're not going to read this list, but we are going to go through all these items. I want to show you at a high level how the implementation recommendations were designed kind of in the plan. We focus on building and maintaining the pedestrian network. So that's thinking about the segments of the network, crossings as its kind of own category. We have a little more work to do there. We had intended to do some of it as part of this plan, and it didn't end up fitting within the workload and scope that we had for the plan. So there's some additional work there that needs to be done that's on as part of some current conversations at the Lawrence City Commission. Transportation and land use and design. So thinking about what do our standards say and how does that integrate into the bigger picture of how we're designing our community, thinking about the pedestrian experience. Safety, comfort, and the streetscape. So this is about traffic safety, driver behavior, and understanding how people are sharing these spaces and what they feel like, and then evaluation. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in detail. So as we talk about the recommendations for understanding where our recommendations about building and maintaining the network, a big part of that is about constructing the prioritized sidewalk gaps. And in our experience with this, we already had detailed through safe routes to school planning and the previous pedestrian plan, the recognition that sidewalks belong on both sides of collector and arterial streets, and one side of local streets that are designated as safe routes to school that are continuous. So those projects had already been identified. Additional projects then were identified based on some pedestrian demand mapping that we had established for access to parks, bus stops, and healthy food destinations that were added to the list, and the recommendation to include those in the non-motorized prioritization policy that is currently in process with the non-motorized with the Multimodal Transportation Commission. So that kind of shows you here about what level of projects and investment and kind of thinking about a high level priority network for pedestrian access across our community. This is at a high level to look system wide at the sidewalk to road ratio. So this is a proxy ratio for us to look at where there is lower than street average sidewalk existence. And we compared this to our minority block groups from census populations and to the transportation disadvantaged populations, and that's on the map on the right with our score. So you can see that there is there are some areas that have both high transportation disadvantaged population scores and low percentage of sidewalk to roadway ratios. And so we looked at these system-wide and what we provided some analysis in the plan about the targeting of the priority projects and how we believe that will address some of the disparity that we found across some of these transportation disadvantaged populations. Here's an example. This block group is the highest transportation disadvantaged block group within our community, where we believe there's the highest above average percentages of populations that experience transportation challenges. And we show here where there is and isn't sidewalk, but also where we have gap projects. And you'll find in the appendices of the plan, every block group for the entire city slated where there is sidewalk and isn't, and what projects or gap projects are planned. This is just kind of an example to show you what we show here, to show what's the roadway percentage before and after we would propose those projects in terms of making some movement on improving access. It doesn't mean sidewalk on every side of one street. That's not what this is about, but it's about connecting a high-level pedestrian network that people can use to access destinations. So thinking about transit, food, parks, schools, and things that are land use planned along our arterial and collector street network. So this is in the plan, and there's some efforts already being made by the Multimodal Transportation Commission to use the transportation disadvantaged population weighting in their decision making for prioritizing projects. And so they just modified that program based on some of the work that we've done in this plan. We recognize that there's still a need to continue to implement the sidewalk improvement program and possibly evolve it as needed based on local conversations, whether that's timeline. I think the thing to note across all of the comments we received is that the work that's currently underway and the work based on the need there is for improvements is not meeting much of the community's expectation in terms of intensity of delivery. So there really is a need to maximize funding to make additional progress on implementing these things, whether that be maintenance or gap infill or even longer term vision. But we recognize there also may be a need to evolve as needed. And we explored very briefly the opportunities, some best practice we maybe saw in some other communities that are doing point of sale sidewalk inspections. So before property transfer can happen, when property is being sold, sidewalks are inspected and must be brought into compliance. And that's something we consider and encourage the city to explore in greater detail based on that program that was pointed out to us as we were doing our research. We also recognize the need to develop and implement an ADA transition plan for the public right-of-way. And we pulled some of the conversation that had happened as part of the 2020 City Accessibility Survey into the conversation, recognizing that this survey, which targeted specifically individuals who experience challenges and barriers navigating the system, to kind of understand what some of those barriers are. And so we envision some of this process to feed into the additional work that needs to be done to understand the condition of the sidewalk network for not only just hazards as the sidewalk improvement program is doing, but thinking about cross slope driveways and additional curb ramp transition. As we got into the excuse me, I'm ahead of myself. As we talked a little bit about earlier about the other work that's being done, crossing times were something that we had a lot of conversation with the community about in terms of at signalized crossings. We took members of our steering committee and members of the community who use assistive devices out to experience some of the intersections that had been retimed to verify they were evaluating current crossing standards. And we experienced at all of the intersections we visited that the crossing times felt reasonably comfortable. It was more the concern of driver behavior, particularly yielding to pedestrians in the crosswalk and right-hand turns that we even experienced when we were out on the street testing these signal timings that really impacted the walkability and comfort feel of some of that street. And that played into our recommendations that come later in terms of behavior enforcement. But we also recognize that while many of the corridors the ones noted in color, have been addressed or are being addressed to verify the signal timing meets the standard. There's additional intersections that should be continued to be verified as the city rolls through that system. Crossing improvements. So we set out to talk to the community about crossing improvements, recognizing that the Multimodal Transportation Commission had had previous conversations about the desire to adopt some identify appropriate crossing improvements and adopt some standards that would help us to be able to score and evaluate intersections. On the far right, you can see kind of a map at a high level of the 147 intersections of concern that the community submitted to us to include, to say, you know, these are intersections that are not signalized that we would like to have explored. And I think the next step here is really building a program that one can bring some engineering expertise to developing and adopting some local countermeasures that are appropriate, and whether through some standards, and then also establishing a methodology to explore these intersections, but really all intersections across the city in a more systematic way, and then be able to feed those into the non-motorized prioritization project programs for future crossing improvements. And then additionally, recognizing that there could be opportunities when you're doing reconstruction or major street maintenance to do bump outs to shorten crossing distances or other crossing improvements that could be rolled out more systematically if those types of improvements were considered as part of those projects. Again, that's a scope and funding issue. And so I think additional funding would have to be identified in scope of work that's, I believe, being proposed to the commission to consider around prioritizing crossings. Some of those may be on shared use paths and include bikeways as well. We asked the community a little bit about recognizing when we think about the long-term vision for sidewalks, we realize that there is an immense amount of need for sidewalk in places where the community standard was not to install sidewalk on both sides of the street when the neighborhood and area was constructed. And so de facto, many of these streets across our community are serving like this center picture. This is actually a Google Street View picture of Ash Street in North Lawrence, where they're really serving as a shared street environment, a yield roadway. And we asked people how comfortable they felt with these pictures on that type of infrastructure. And you can see very uncomfortable or somewhat uncomfortable was the predominant response that we got there. And I think the reality of that really plays into driver behavior. The reality is, I think for the very long term, these street types are going to exist in our community, and that even more brings into importance the need for user behavior, addressing behavior issues of roadway users. And so thinking about how enforcement impacts the culture we create in our community and how people feel comfortable on the streets operating or in shared spaces, whether they're biking or driving. We also recognize that even though there's ongoing BRIC committee, and not sure of their timeline for the work that they're doing both for BRIC street standards and BRIC sidewalk standards, but we call the need to establish some BRIC sidewalk standards. All right, we explored through some research the consideration of the pedestrian experience in the land development code, and we really framed that under the four bullets kind of there that you see in terms of thinking about how that should be reframed in the land development code and considered as part of the conversation, and provide some direction in terms of walkability, of how walkability could be benefited by thinking about pedestrian scale, pedestrian oriented, connective road patterns, density of residential and commercial construction, and development within the current footprint of the city. And so we could expand a little more on those, but we also recognize the need to incorporate the long-term sidewalk vision into the land development code. And we did some work here trying to understand what the public expectation is. We did some high-level planning estimates to show if on that chart, you'll see if we were looking at sidewalks on all sides of all streets, at the current funding level, we're funding gaps. We're looking at about 250 years to be able to construct all the sidewalks. And so that doesn't include some of the costs of right-of-way and other things. And so this is a really just high-level planning number, which isn't within our lifetime. And I think that really begs the question to think about and where we really got to in terms of establishing some priorities, recognizing all of the other need, not just for new infill of or sidewalk network, but also thinking about maintenance, maintaining what we have and maintaining it and it transitioning to accessible routes, that in the balancing of some of those priorities, that the long-term vision for sidewalk should be to have at least sidewalk on both sides of new and existing arterial and collectors and both sides of new local streets, and as a retrofit, one side of all existing local streets. And so you can see that still only brings us down to 150 years. And that may still have to be additional conversation as part of the land development code to recognize what the retrofit looks like as we're piecemeal developing in some locations, what the reality is about when sidewalks should be constructed. And we have some additional work that we feel like should be clarified as part of that land development code. We recognize as part of safety and comfort the need to reestablish the traffic enforcement unit with Lawrence Police Department and to continue to implement neighborhood traffic management and elevate enforcement of not only speeding, but also failure to yield. We provide some study examples of communities that have used targeted enforcement of failure to yield to pedestrians effectively. And we highlight that kind of in the plan as a consideration. That could be some additional enforcement that targets behavior that the community has really reported of concern. We recognized and we heard from community members about concerns of conflicting users of the sidewalk. So not only just bicycles, but electric and motorized vehicles, and recognize that additional work needs to be done to review and update maybe regulations in regards to who uses those spaces and education to users about how they use those in a way that provides a safe and comfortable environment for all people. We recognize through the work on our staff team we call for the need to reestablish the fatality crash investigations, partnership between Lawrence Police Department and Municipal Services and Operations to identify crash data to identify future geometric improvements for roadways. And we explored some best practices nationally about implementing some pedestrian legal frameworks to decriminalize walking, addressing anti-harassment and jaywalking, and the equitable impact they've had in our communities and across the country. And so that's recognized in the plan. As we talk about some of the built environment things, we recognize that not only just street trees and lighting, but also winter weather policies, block driveways, brush clearance, wayfinding, and transit amenities all impact the usability of the sidewalk pedestrian network. And so we have recommendations kind of about elevating those different components as part of the system that supports walkability. When we looked at performance across the system, we identified 5 evaluation factors. So one of which is the percent of public streets with sidewalks on at least one side. That PM2, this comes from Transportation 2040. And so you can see we've begun tracking that in 2017, and you can see that change in time since 2020. From the City of Lawrence Strategic Plan, Connected City outcome, number 5, percentage of sidewalks and shared use paths in compliance with ADA and deflection minimum standards. That's currently at 20%. We would say that's a metric that should be tracked over time as part of the plan implementation evaluation. Additionally, we recognize that because we're really honing in on the pedestrian priority network, we wanted to track the miles of gaps. And we have it in the plan divided out by which part of the network it's on. Some are double counted because it may be a safe route and also an arterial collector, or it may have park access and also something else. But overall, that's about 50 miles. And then 2 other measures that we felt were valuable from the Transportation 2040, PM13 and PM26, which is number of non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries on all public roadways. And that includes bike and ped. So you can see that metric here as we continue to track that in the development and implementation of our long range plan, and percentage of pedestrian mode choice, which is currently at 5.9%. We posted this plan for a 30-day public comment period from February 28th to March 30th. And through that work, just a second. Didn't like how I shared it. We identified a list of comments that we received from the community, and those were included, attached on the agenda and included in the plan. When we have our work on these type of plans and reduce this draft document, we recognize we're asking a lot of the community, because by the time we've published a draft, it's quite an extensive document. And we received a variety of comments that we kind of tried to section into topic areas here. And in some of those comments, we received them. In some of the comments, we forwarded them to an appropriate party. In a few cases, when we noted in here, we added some notation in the plan based on the comments that we received. And that's available for your review. If you want to talk about any of those in more detail, we can. And then we also received an additional letter of support from the Healthy Built Environment Work Group, expressing support of the plan and the goals to advance walkability in the plan. The Multimodal Transportation Commission and the MPO Technical Advisory Committee recommended approval of this plan at their May meetings. And I'd be happy to entertain any question or conversation you want about any components of the plan or the work that we did with the steering committee over the last year.
Girl, you know I'm about to come at you about sidewalks, but I want to make sure everybody asks their questions.
Yeah, Matt Messina, KDOT. I did have a couple of questions of some of the items that you may have addressed or alluded to. Is there an element of this plan that can also satisfy a portion of a vulnerable road user assessment to kind of map out where crash history is more prevalent?
Yeah, Jessica Marger, Transportation Planning Manager. There is some of that, although I think we'd have to look at that in some greater detail with maybe some additional history, because just playing on some of the locational analysis with the vulnerable road users, it would be a little bit like playing whack-a-mole in terms of trying to address specific locations. I think as you look at a lot of some of the behavior data, that we really feel that while we need to partner some of the built environment improvements around walking, you know, to make the crossings and make walking feel more comfortable, we also realize that without enforcement, that there and change in culture, that many people are already choosing not to be a pedestrian, or they're impacting where they choose to walk based on how they feel on the streets and how people are operating. And so I think there could be additional work done. I think it probably needs to go beyond just the crash data understanding for geometric improvements, just if you're talking about just bike and ped, and really into targeting some of the behavior as we think about user behavior. And so I would say there's probably a lot of more information to understand, even in addition to some of the additional work that's happened as part of neighborhood traffic management, that this could provide the basis for that. But I think a lot of additional work probably needs to be done to really dive into that, to understand where you're going to make the most impact for impacting user behavior and comfort for walkability.
Okay. That actually aids to the next question that I have. Was your PED trip number, I think it was 5.6, 5.9%. Is that specific to work-related commutes, or did you acquire additional trips information for PED to make up that PED mode share?
I believe that's the census journey to work information. So I believe you're looking at, this is not based on any local numbers. That's solely based on the census derived information, which I believe is from their journey to work travel information.
Because that's very high for commutes to work for the state. So that's good. And then the last one I have is related to any extension or advancements to a count program to continue tracking maybe non-work related trips that are also occurring and keeping data continually coming in.
Yeah, Justin Martin, your Transportation Planning Manager. I think we highlight some of the existing counts that we have as part of the existing conditions. We don't have a specific recommendation around counts, but our partnership with the city has kind of evolved over the last few years as part of the neighborhood traffic management program for the city of Lawrence has purchased bicycle and pedestrian counters. And so those are owned locally. And we, at the beginning of COVID, we were evaluating our opportunity to test those and validate those because there's a couple different types of counters. One requires video observation and additional funding to either manually staff review the videos and document those or send them off to be counted, and that has a cost with it as part of that program, and also just some tube counters which can count bike solo counts. So we have talked in partnership in that larger picture, not within the metrics of the plan, about how that's going to continue. And I think that's still a question that's going to be out there to see where we figure out. I know there's conversations locally about big data and the role of cell phone user data and big data subscriptions to use some of that data as a more value add. But I'm not sure where we're going to end up in terms of the amount of time and effort that it takes for manual bike ped counts based on the validity of those. I think we need to do some additional work before I could say there's one answer that I feel like is appropriate for this region.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions?
Matt
Okay.
Roberts, Lecompton City Council. Sorry. I had a question. You talked about or mentioned decriminalizing jaywalking. Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. So across the nation, there is empirical evidence that that the criminalization of jaywalking and the use of that to ticket people who are walking as vulnerable users really came from the space of liability with auto users and how that evolved over the course of time in terms of placing liability on who's at fault, recognizing some of that. When you look nationally at some of the data around the populations that are ticketed for jaywalking, we find that there's a predominance of tickets that are issued that impact minority and low income populations, and recognizing the criminality of that and the impact, severity of kind of the disproportionate impacts, that there's recognition that it doesn't benefit anyone to make people feel safer. It doesn't actually impact safety to have it be illegal to jaywalk. And so there's some research happening nationally about that we believe should be explored as a local opportunity to explore if there's disparate impacts within the local information. I don't know that it's something that that is used regularly or often. And if it doesn't impact safety, then there's consideration to explore whether or not we feel it's appropriate to continue to have it be illegal with a fine to jaywalk.
Gotcha. And that goes along with the, in parentheses, says anti-harassment. I'm assuming that's the vulnerable population you're talking about.
Yeah, and the anti-harassment one is a little bit different, but recognizing that much of the that a predominance of women and vulnerable persons have experienced sexual harassment or harassment on the streets being pedestrians, and that criminalizes that behavior to create a safer culture for vulnerable persons who choose to use walking as their mode of transportation. Street violence and street harassment are reported, kind of abuse in that way of those people, and creating a culture around safety that really focuses on those vulnerable users, recognizes that some of that behavior should be made illegal.
Gotcha. And I got one more quick question. You mentioned bringing back the traffic unit with the Lawrence Police Department. Has there been conversation held about that?
I believe so. There has been, and I've been periphery to it in just a few ways, in the sense that as part of a public conversation that the traffic unit hasn't existed for a number of years, and the result of impact that's had on ticketing, but also speed across the community. And so I'm pretty sure, and Courtney, I guess you can correct me if I'm wrong, one of the more recent reports that had been done that I saw in our partnership with police department on the multimodal team for the city recommended the reestablishment of traffic enforcement also. And so it's kind of consistent with city conversation that has been going on. I believe it really is a budget and financial issue. And so that will be something that, as we think about the role of traffic enforcement and culture, we recognize that safer streets means a culture where people don't expect to be able to speed or not yield to people, and that plays a role in how people feel on our streets.
Thank you.
Commissioner Shanklin?
Hi, this is Shanklin, Planning Committee. All right, and I apologize at the outset. I'm having terrible broadband.
Commissioner Shanklin, does it help if you call in?
It might be for the, so it may not affect it, but can you hear me now?
For the moment.
Okay, just really quickly then, this comments are for Jessica, and I'm interested in her. Having spent 35 years as a resident in New York City, I'm very familiar with being a pedestrian and the benefits of shorter pedestrian trips. What we've seen here in our materials in the presentation today is a really good analysis, I think, of existing conditions. So I'm thinking more about the medium and long-term problem that we're describing here, but addressing mostly in terms of short-term application. And the medium and long-term problem, I think, can be best addressed density. And I find the density imperative missing from this discussion. I mean, there was one reference in the material in the presentation today to allowing greater density in residential areas. And from a fiscal perspective and from the perspective of pedestrian satisfaction, density is critical. And we're talking a lot of concrete here. It's for the medium and long term, this problem of improving the pedestrian experience, and from a fiscal standpoint for the city and the county, is best addressed by increasing density in the urban core and limiting it at the periphery. Otherwise, the problem just gets bigger over time. So, Jessica, I'm curious why we don't see more about the density imperative in this discussion.
Yeah, Jessica Morton, your transportation planning manager. I guess from our perspective, as we think about the pedestrian experience and we think about the call that we kind of put out around the land development code, we felt that that was made clear. I'm sorry to say that I guess nobody alerted us, or we didn't feel like additional emphasis on that was needed based on the recommendations. I'd be happy to entertain your thought about how we should do that, or how you would have liked to seen that done in a different way. This plan really is highlighting at a high level kind of a lot of different work elements that need to be done. And you're right, the longest term one really is the land development code and what's happening in relationship to how that work gets carried out. And we made recommendations in relationship to a bunch of elements that we believe need to be considered in that. So
okay, sorry to put you on the spot, but
okay.
I was hoping you'd say that we've got some work going on to better understand the benefits of density. I mean, there's a lot of computation to do, but to just say that allowing greater density, it should be a compunction. We really need to cause greater density to occur as a key component of improving our pedestrian plan and access. So I just, you know, one person's comments here, but it's a really important issue, and I'd like to see it raised more often.
Any other questions? Okay. So I think I want to start on page 10. Jessica. Let me scroll for a second here. Yeah, so the enforcement of the improvement program, and I think it's mentioned in a couple other spaces I'll get to here, but the Kansas statute does not mandate that homeowners pay for their sidewalks. It allows cities to force that, but it does not mandate that they have to pay out of pocket for their sidewalks. And it happens quite frequently. What's interesting, as you know, with community development block grant money is often used for our GAP sidewalk programs, and the homeowner is never the wiser what those costs are, just a sidewalk appears. So that's at least one example of where we do not force every homeowner to purchase a sidewalk out of their own pocket. So I just want to be sure we're very careful in our wording with these statements, that we don't make it seem like, and we frequently do, that we have no other choice than the one that we have no other options of funding than the way we have them now. So just kind of this first sentence here, I just want to be clear that that certainly gives the impression that what we do is the only way it can be done. And I always have a real hard time with that. The next thing I think would be page 20. And there's, oh, actually before that, let's, page 13, the sidewalk distribution equity evaluation. That's a really great section, and it has a lot of important information and is a great acknowledgement of the different ways that people have been treated in different neighborhoods in terms of connectivity. But in terms of equity, and while I'm well aware that the funding specifically was not in your purview of discussion, but another inequity is what I just pointed out, which is that some people get free sidewalks and some people don't. And that it's pretty whimsically up to us who those people are. While it may not be a racial inequity, it will almost definitely be a socioeconomic inequity, and kind of an unjustifiable one. So I don't think it is too much to point out that our current funding structures are not equitable. Do not treat homeowners or landowners or taxpayers in an equitable way. And that was actually, if memory serves, one of the things that was asked of some studies and steering committees in the past, and has pretty much never happened. The next thing was maybe page 27, or actually we could go to. So the questioning of people, page 20, asking people about where they want sidewalks on both sides of the street. That's great information, but also they didn't have all the information they needed. When you ask someone, do you want sidewalks on both sides of the street, on every street, which seems to be kind of a prevailing feeling, what you don't tell them is who pays for it. And I find constantly, even right now, as people are getting their letters of who will be paying for their sidewalk, is an absolute misunderstanding of who ends up paying for the maintenance of the sidewalks. And I really believe people will answer that question differently when they realize that it will come out of their own personal pocket. So even now, when we all know that our valuations have gone up, people will be getting a letter telling them that suddenly they owe thousands of dollars out of pocket on a sidewalk and their neighbor doesn't have one. So again, with the inequity, but in particular in terms of asking the public what they think, I don't think they have the full information, and that the full information would elicit a different answer. If you know that one side of the street on local streets is sufficient, then your answer might be different when you find out you're the one going to pay for it out of your pocket. And that information isn't, in the way the question is asked. So I'm always going to quibble about stuff like that. And I think we can get to 27. Yeah. Oops. The continue to implement the sidewalk improvement program. And I appreciate the evolve as needed, but it still has some pretty definite language that, for example, the legal requirement of the Kansas statute is still somewhat misleading in my view to people to understand who's on the hook for the sidewalk that they expect. I do appreciate the sort of understanding of the discussion that's been going on in the city for several years. That's really well balanced, and I appreciate that. But I would still say, I also appreciate that it is kind of calling us out that we need to fund these things in a diplomatic way. I appreciate that. The other thing I kind of wanted to ask about was the brick and your recommendation that we finished up those recommendations. The last time I checked, nobody knew where we were at on that. So as a book report, could you maybe email me and let me know? I think the person who was maybe in charge of it switched positions, and maybe it's just a ball that got dropped, because I think some of the people on that steering committee have not heard from anyone in over a year. So
yeah. If you want me to answer that, to my understanding of that is that the staff member who was assigned that responsibility is no longer with the organization. And as a result of that, it's being evaluated and reassigned and reshuffled and prioritized in workload. And so I would also note that through the development of that, just the understanding that as that BRIC committee formed, it may also, as it stands, not meet the intent of community engagement and may need to be more robustly represented, not just by people who love brick sidewalks, but also by more balanced issues to recognize people who have challenges using brick sidewalks. And so to represent an end result of a committee that's probably more balanced, I would hope that there's some efforts to reestablish a group that's more representative of all the perspectives before that work re-begin. But you're right. We got called, that's one of the questions we got called out on in terms of just saying that what we provided wasn't enough information, and we have no other information besides that was given to us. So.
Well, it's not your responsibility to figure out who that person is, but if you accidentally figure out who I maybe need to email for follow-up, I will be happy to do that, but I understand that's not your responsibility. I did kind of have a lighting question, a non-sidewalk question, because there's been some things come up recently in our neighborhood asking for one light. And so I appreciate the suggestions here, but also in terms of, okay, if we approve this, then what would I tell the public to do next on some of these things as action items? The city already knew we needed to reevaluate our lighting policy, which is sort of restrictive for some areas and too much for others. I mean, every neighborhood's a little different. And kind of in as much as any of the commissioners sort of tried to ask about it or get it assigned to someone, our answer honestly was it doesn't really have anything to do with the strategic plan right now. So we don't have any reason to put it on the top of the pile. And so I like the way you've outlined it here. And so I wondered if you would just give me advice, you don't have to do it now, on how to help navigate people to try to move that issue into an action item.
My short answer is after the city commission evaluates this plan and considers it, when they come to a conclusion about adopting it, it will be the locally and regionally, when we get to that place, adopted pedestrian plan. And there is a component under Connected City in the strategies that says implement the pedestrian plan. And this is a component of the pedestrian plan. So that's your linkage.
Thank you for that. If there's no more questions, this is a public comment item. Is there any public comment?
I see no one in person or no one raising their hand online to comment on this item.
Okay, then let's make sure there's any discussion between commissioners on this item. Come on, Patrick, you want to talk about sidewalks so bad. I can see it on your face.
Can I add one more thing? So in this process, I think we had a lot of conversation with the steering committee and in the Multimodal Transportation Commission, recognizing the fact that for some people, this plan doesn't go far enough. For others, this plan goes too far, and that it's trying to find a balance really of different strategies, programs, policies, actions that can be taken to improve walkability. And we saw as a reflection of the work as we reviewed where we have been since the Ped Bike Issues Task Force report, which I think was from 2016, and the previous pedestrian plan, that a lot of progress has been made in this space, and that it's going to be a constantly evolving process, and to recognize it as that and realize this is a list of stuff that we're going to have to prioritize into workloads with all of the other priorities. And as we get to that, none of these are overnight fixes. These are all going to have to be balanced with other priorities. And so it really hopes to take a wide range view to recognize all the components that it takes. Did we get everything? No, I don't think so. I think, many of you pointed things out, some of the community pointed things out that they would have liked to see in more detail or more work done or less work or other things. And I think we have to recognize that we now have in this process, this is the second pedestrian plan that the MPO has incorporated into our workload. We are with this plan talking about amending what it takes to amend the plan and or work on the plan, recognizing it's now on a 5-year rotating cycle to update every 5 years in a process that happens before we update our long range transportation plan. And in those processes, in the recognition that this is constantly evolving, I think brings a little bit of clarity to the fact that we will need to continue to do this work and take a lot of effort in a bunch of different areas in the meantime to put together a total picture of transportation as we continue our work on Transportation 2050, which is even longer term. But recognizing we plan to be back at this again in 5 years and revise this process. In the meantime, recognizing a lot of other stuff is going to have happened in that time, and we'll have the opportunity to see how well we've done and if we've gone far enough or too far in that space.
Any other discussion? Is that Commissioner Shanklin? Make sure he can hear us if that's him.
I could hear you. I had to switch over to audio, so I'm still with you.
Okay.
Do you have any comments or anything? Okay. I guess then if there's no more discussion, I will entertain a motion.
I'll make the motion to approve the pedestrian plan. Matt Messina, KDOT.
This is Commissioner Kelly. I'll second.
I have a first and a second. Paul, can you do roll for us?
Kelly, Kelly,
Yes.
You said yes 4
Gotcha.
times.
I wasn't coming through on my end.
Okay.
Messina,
Yes.
Roberts,
Yes.
Shanklin,
Yes.
Shipley.
I don't want to vote against this, but you know what my issues are. So I think although strange to do it, I think the only thing I can do to express how important it is to me is to abstain.
Okay, the motion passes 4 with 4 yes and 1 abstain.
This is Commissioner Kelly. I have to go to another meeting, but I wanted to be here for that vote and make sure we had a full quorum. Maybe you can't hear me.
Can you hear him?
I do now,
Okay,
yes.
great.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, that brings us to quick updates.
Yeah, Jessica Morton, your Transportation Planning Manager. Transportation 2050 public engagement is underway, and you can find out more information about that now or at the website. We have, at the link provided, we have begun doing tabling, talking to users about their transportation experiences to help inform the work as we lay out the Transportation 2050. We have a federal fiscal year 21 to 24 TIP amendment underway for June consideration. We have a whole bunch of projects, so be on the lookout for that. Particularly in relationship to the award of $2.7 million from Transit for their AIC, the Access, Innovation, and Collaboration Awards they won from KDOT. We are working on a Title VI and LEP, Limited English Proficiency Plan updates following our Public Participation Plan update. And we have posted their recent TAC minutes and the monthly KDOT update link from KDOT if Matt has anything to add to that.
Yeah, again, the link hasn't been updated in a while due to being understaffed and on parental leave. However, I do want to announce that we do have hired recently a brand new position to manage our new electric vehicle program funds, which has been very hot and popular. Everyone's excited about it. I'd be more than happy to share that contact information if anyone in your community is interested in learning more about the program and the direction of the agency with those funds as we're required to administer them on behalf of the state.
Just like I had kind of not really, well, maybe it is a question. So, you know, I follow this social media and I see some things that get more play. And I feel like sometimes, like I haven't seen anything about the Transportation 2050 on city social media. I don't know if that's a breakdown between you and communications or what, but I would like to see more of the things I learn about just because I come to this meeting, get more play in social media or multiple, postings and stuff like that, because it's really important.
So it's my understanding, I think there has already been at least one post, but we will follow up. We have a whole plethora of notations throughout public comment that we provide photos and messages to post, and we try to coordinate that. So we will follow up. But I also know sometimes the city pays. They have a budget for engagement, and we don't currently have a budget for engagement. So that's something maybe that we need to consider in relationship to that. When we looked at the data related to previous programs that have paid for different engagement, the clicks they got didn't necessarily seem worth the return on investment versus just tabling in places. So we can reevaluate that. But I think that's maybe part of the challenge is some of those, if they're not getting boosted with paid advertisement, then you're not seeing them as much. And that's just program budget that plays into that in terms of from the city's profile.
And Jessica, I can also address that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, we haven't really been pushing the social media on 2050 yet. The goal was kind of to get it set up, and I assure you that there are going to be some social media posts coming in the next few weeks before the survey closes. So we will be pushing that for sure.
Anything else, Jessica, on that report? Okay. Is there any other business? Okay, so our next meeting will be June 16th. And we don't need to reschedule it like we did this month. It doesn't look like, unless Jessica informs us otherwise. All right, and I think that brings us to the end of this meeting. It was lovely to see all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you.